Our New Testament lesson today comes from 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 to 24. Listen for a word from God. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods and sees a brother or sister in need and yet refuses help? Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. And by this we will know that we are from the truth and will reassure our hearts before him whenever our hearts condemn us. For God is greater than our hearts and knows everything. Beloved, if our hearts do not condemn us, we have boldness before God, and we receive from God whatever we ask, because we obey God's commandments and do what pleases him. And this is God's commandment, that we should believe in the name of the Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another, just as we have been commanded. All who obey God's commandments abide in him, and he abides in them. And by this we know that God abides in us, by the Spirit that has been given us. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Ken Ilgunas set out in September of 2012 to take a journey. His goal was to walk the entire path of the proposed Keystone XL pipeline. So he started in Alberta in September and ended in Texas at the Gulf. He set out for many reasons. He's an adventurer at heart. He had worked in mining in Alaska. He was very much an environmental activist, and he wanted to draw attention to the pipeline. And he set out to prove himself right. He wanted to be able to say to the world and to the activist community, see, I have credentials, I did this. And a funny thing happened on his journey. He expected to find people on one side who were very angry that anyone would oppose the pipeline. He, in his book, writes about expecting overalls and baseball caps and guns and pickup trucks, stereotypical type things. On the other hand, he also expected to encounter hippies, dreadlocks and tree huggers, and people who would chain themselves to whatever it would take to stop the path of the pipeline. He had everybody in one of the two camps, and he expected everyone to fit in his categories. And though along the way a handful of people fit into both, what he encountered was something different. He encountered people who offered him hospitality. As he was walking along the road and they would drive by, they would stop and ask if he would like a ride. He found people who would offer him a warm meal. He was invited into people's homes. More than once, he was offered a place to spend the night and to take a shower. He expected anger on both sides and instead found hospitality. He found people who were marginally in favor of or marginally opposed to the pipeline. But they were in favor or opposed because of how it impacted them. They wanted to live their life and make a living on the land that had been in their families for generations. He found people that wanted the pipeline because if they didn't get the money that provided them, they would have to sell the land. And he found people who were marginally opposed They were worried about what it would do to the water, but who also needed the money that would provide. And along the way, though he didn't change his mind, he shut up long enough to listen and to understand where other people were coming from. He sacrificed his strongly held beliefs in order to listen and learn from other people's. And it was a life-changing experience for him. Now, at the end, Mr. Ogunas still fights for environmental activism. He still opposes the pipeline, but not the same way he did before. Totally different story. Michael W. Smith wrote a song and sang it, it's pretty old, called Kentucky Rose. It's about a farmer, I would assume in Kentucky, who worked the land. And this farmer was also the preacher at the local church. The song tells about Kentucky Rose and his gentle spirit, how he would work the land and work with people, how he practiced what he preached. We would say he walked the walk. How people for miles around would come just to spend time with him, to have a chat, to tell a story to someone willing to listen. And then one night, Kentucky Rose was out for an evening walk, and as he crossed a bridge, he saw a boy trapped on a rocky ridge. And Kentucky Rose, at that point, went to help the boy. I don't think there's anybody in this room that wouldn't have gone to help a boy trapped on this rocky ledge. In the story, in the song, the boy is saved. But Kentucky, his life is lost. And then it goes on to tell about how peaceful he looked, laid out in his Sunday best, and how they buried him up on a hill. And on that hill now, one flower grows. And they say it is the spirit of this Kentucky Rose. It's a story of self-sacrifice. Not by somebody who set out to sacrifice their life. That would be crazy. But by someone who, in the circumstances he was in, did what needed to be done. We all would do the same. Now, we would hopefully not lose our own lives. I don't even know if that story is true. But it tells about being who you need to be in the place where you find yourself. Today's epistle lesson talks about self-sacrifice, and it's not a comfortable topic because it's hard to change. It's hard to be like Ken Ilgunas, who had to set aside his beliefs in order to listen. It's not easy to think about someone who's helping a little boy who then dies. And yet, it's what we're called to do. If you remember, and I know you remember, God emptied God's self and chose to live life as a particular human being in flesh at a particular time in history. God didn't have to do that. That is a sacrifice of self. And then Jesus, as he lived and taught and preached, sacrificed a lot in the life that he lived in order to teach and preach. And then allowed himself to be sacrificed. It's not an easy story. And if we make it an easy story, we're jumping over the pain and the discomfort and the terror that provides. But at the same time, it is a story of God who lives just like us and says, look, I get it. I'm not asking anything of you that I won't do. I'm not asking anything of you that I haven't done. Self-sacrifice doesn't mean dying. It doesn't mean jumping in and seeking out ways to sacrifice yourself. It means living your life in the moment you are in. Parents and grandparents and great-grandparents will do anything for their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. I didn't even bring it up, and Bob brought it up in Sunday school today. He says that moment when you first hold your grandbaby and you know that you would do anything for that little person. It's a sacrifice of self. Today is Earth Day. And when we talk about self-sacrifice, we often talk about that in relation to our neighbors and our friends and our family and our enemies. But God created the earth too. And there is beauty that comes from the garbage of life. From people who go to save a little boy and fall off a cliff. From people who have to set aside their strongly held way of thinking in order to listen to what other people believe. There is beauty in God living a life like ours. It is the sacrifice that we are called to make. Not only for the people around us, but for the world that supports us. If you notice back here, we have this beautiful table with the water and the trash. And in the midst of that, we have a beautiful plant that is growing. Beauty can come from the hard stuff, from the sacrifices that we never wanted to make, but would make again. Self-sacrifice is more than about people, and it's more than about our environment. It's about living your life as Jesus teaches and calls. May it be so. Amen.